Fiona, I'll have to leave and then join again.
Okay, that's fine. Hello, everyone that's joining us. Welcome to this webinar. Sorry, we're just taking a few minutes to get things sorted with some technical difficulties. We'll be starting in a few minutes. We've got 19 people, 20 people online. That's awesome. Don't get starstruck, Adam. Lots of people out there. Okay. We've got a lovely picture of Troy at the moment with his octopus.
Oh, is that what that is?
There we go. Okay, well, we might as well get started. I'm Fiona Mackay and I'm part of the Hunter Environmental Institute Committee and welcoming you today to our presentation by Adam Gilligan from the EPA. Thank you for joining us, Adam. It's great to have someone of your calibre joining us today and to talk about contamination in the Hunter. Oh, you're welcome. As we gather today virtually, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work. For those in Newcastle, this is the Awabakal people. This webinar is brought to you by HEI and it was established in 1988 to provide a forum for the interaction of people working in environmentally oriented fields in the Hunter region. HEI is a non-profit organisation managed by a committee and operating under a formal constitution. Our major events are regular seminars and soon to be seminars in person, hopefully, featuring presentations by guest speakers on a specific issue within a broad range of environmental topics. Annual memberships are now due and you will have access to lots of great events that we're planning that are coming up. Memberships are available for corporate members as well as individuals and students to help cover the event costs for seminars and sponsorship and scholarships for students through the University of Newcastle. If you're interested in getting involved with the HEI committee or have suggestions for one-off events or ongoing events, please contact us via Facebook or the HEI website, or just sign up for our newsletter and you'll hear all about our upcoming events. At the end of the presentation, I'll be sharing about a new opportunity to become an HEI intern. We've got one of our interns at the moment who's online, Shufan, and he's helping me in the background. We would like to extend our thanks to the University of Newcastle who are hosting this webinar for us and to our gold corporate sponsor, NGH. NGH is a full service planning and environmental consultancy with a strong focus on renewables and conservation. Since 1992, NGH has helped deliver over 7,000 megawatts of renewable infrastructure, and as industry leaders are proud to assist in the transition to a sustainable future. NGH has 8 offices in New South Wales, including in Newcastle, the ACT, where I am at the moment, Queensland and Victoria. For all your needs in ecology, heritage, town planning, environmental assessment, social impact assessment and community engagement, bushfire and contamination, from planning to construction and operation, NGH can assist you. For more information, see their website, www.nghconsulting.com.au. So, on to today's proceedings. And today's presentation by Adam Gilligan from the EPA on managing contaminated land in the Hunter region. We'll be hearing from Adam, who holds the role as Director of Regulatory Operations for the Regulatory Operations Metropolitan Division at the New South Wales Environment Protection Authority. Adam joined local government in 1996 as an Environment Protection Officer before leading several regulatory teams. From 2009, Adam was the Compliance Services Manager at Newcastle City Council, responsible for environment protection, environmental health, food surveillance, development compliance, fire safety, ranges and parking regulation. Adam joined the EPA in 2014 as Manager of the Hunter region and was Regional Director North from 2016 to 2020. Adam led several environmental regulatory activities in the Hunter, including the Dust Stop Mine program, the EPA's response to lead contamination in North Lake Macquarie, and the Williamtown contamination issue. Adam's interest in regulatory reform has seen him present on the topic at A-Alert seminars and several public inquiries. He holds a Bachelor of Environmental Science and a Master's in Leadership and Management Policy, and from Charles Sturt University. So the presentation today will go for about 45 minutes, depending how long Adam wants to talk for, with some time at the end for questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the question and answer section at the bottom of your screen. There's a chat area where you can chat with other people, but the Q&A is where we want to see the questions. During the presentation, make sure your microphones are muted, which I think they automatically are, and your video off until our question time. So take it away, Adam. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Now I'm just going to set up my screen share for my presentation, which won't take a moment. And hopefully you've got that there now. So
Awesome.
Let's come through. Great.
Yeah.
So thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all today. There's a few things I want to cover, and firstly a little bit about the contaminated land management framework in New South Wales, and then I'm going to speak to a couple of specific contamination issues that we've faced in recent years here in the Hunter. PFAS contamination at Williamtown, lead contamination in the northern parts of Lake Macquarie, and also some of the challenges of a couple of gasworks sites in Hamilton North and Waratah. So just to kick off, a little bit about the contaminated land management framework in New South Wales, and I guess a little bit about what contaminated land really is. This is the sort of technical definition, I guess, which is the presence of a substance in, on or under the land at a concentration above that which is normally present, and which constitutes a risk of harm to either human health and or the environment. And contamination can be from a range of substances, often due to human activity, often industrial activity that's occurred. And of course, the history of the Hunter is such that we've got quite an industrial past, and often former industrial areas have been converted to other land uses. So that's often where we see conflict arise, where we see land being put to more sensitive land uses, and a need for us to address the legacy that's left behind by those former activities. How do we regulate contaminated land in New South Wales? Well, it's really a partnership between a number of agencies and using a number of different tools to get results. The key role for the Environment Protection Authority is regulating the Contaminated Land Management Act, and that's really dealing with significant contamination. In fact, that's the term used in the legislation is contamination that's considered significant enough to warrant regulation. And that's really for contamination that does pose an immediate risk to human health or the environment. So while the EPA focuses on dealing with that acute sort of issue, the planning process has a key role in dealing with contamination that is perhaps less of an immediate risk. And we do that through administration of the State Environmental Planning Policy 55, SEP 55, and also the planning guidelines that sit beneath SEP 55. And that's really about using opportunities that arise through the development process to improve land, well, to assess the condition of land, particularly where potentially contaminating land uses have occurred in the past, and also to take the opportunity presented by development activity to remediate that land and arguably take it to a higher purpose. And that's particularly critical, as I say, when you're dealing with a situation where land might have been used for industrial or commercial activity in the past and potentially contaminating activities, and is being put to a more sensitive land use, such as residential or things like childcare centres and the like. It's interesting how often near a contaminated site you can find a sensitive land use like a school or a childcare centre. One of the key principles in the Contaminated Land Management Act is a duty for responsible persons to notify the EPA when they've got contamination that exceeds guidelines, meets certain criteria set out in the regulation, or has migrated or has the potential to migrate off-site. And we've got guidelines in place that provide guidance to landowners and consultants and the like on the sorts of circumstances that trigger that process. And that's often the first way that contamination is brought to our attention. Of course, we also have a proactive role in identifying particularly sensitive activities that might warrant further regulation, and potentially doing proactive audits and inspections to investigate those risks. Once we are made aware of contamination, essentially we move into a process where we look at issuing notices to undertake preliminary investigation into that contamination, and that may well lead to a declaration of a site as significant enough to warrant regulation. And then we tend to move into a process where we look to engage with the landowner or the polluter in a voluntary management proposal for those sites that would involve further assessment and remediation where appropriate. Sometimes where we can't achieve voluntary management orders, we'll move into more formal ones. And this is an ongoing process. So often, even once we've got to a point where orders have been satisfied, there is a process of ensuring that there's ongoing monitoring and maintenance of the sites to ensure that any remediation work that's done remains effective into the future and minimises ongoing risk. So essentially, as an outcome of an initial assessment by us against criteria set out in the legislation, we'll either determine that regulation's warranted, that regulation's not warranted, that it's sufficient to allow contamination to be managed through the planning process, or in some cases, particularly with service stations, we'll use the underground petroleum storage system regulation to ensure that there's appropriate mechanisms in place to address contamination. So that's really the key EPA role. But in terms of planning authorities and their role, and that's the Department of Planning and also local councils, the development approval or rezoning stage provides an opportunity for us to assess prior land use and potential contamination, and that's really set out in that planning policy that councils must, and council land planning must assess the potential for contamination to adversely affect the suitability of a site for its proposed use. And obviously that suitability will vary depending on the sensitivity of that proposed use. As I say, if it was an industrial activity that's occurred in the past and the site's going to continue to be used for industrial purposes, it's likely to be held to a lower standard in terms of remediation than if it was to be put to a more sensitive land use, such as residential activities. So SEP 55 sets out when you need to do consent for remediation. It sets out certain standards for that remediation, and also with further investigations required if contamination is suspected. And it also requires councils to be notified in respect to remediation work that occurs. The planning guidelines helpfully set out the types of activities that are considered to be potentially contaminating. Things like service stations are an obvious case where we know that the risk of contamination from that activity in the past is a risk, and so something that would be taken into account when a site is being proposed for further development. One of the key ways that both councils and the EPA remain aware of those risks is through what used to be called Section 149 certificates under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, now Section 10.7 planning certificates. And they're a tool to allow us to understand what information might exist about prior activities. It might involve prior assessments that have been done of contamination. It might also involve knowledge about previous contaminating activities, or in fact details about remediation work that occurs. And that's not only useful for the regulators, but particularly useful for prospective purchasers to understand the risks that they might be facing in terms of taking on a property, whether that's direct exposure risks or financial risks in terms of obligations to carry out further works. Given that this is a partnership in regulating contaminated land between both the EPA and councils in particular, one of the key strategies that we take is to build capacity in local government so that they can support our work in this regulatory space. And the EPA across 2019 to 2022 is providing $1.4 million to project officers across regional councils, and that includes the Hunter Joint Organisation. And those officers work closely with each of the councils to build capacity in understanding contaminated land issues and building policy and procedures to support the work of those individual councils. And that's also involved supporting works to transition the regulation of underground petroleum storage systems, essentially underground tanks at service stations, back to local government. The EPA took on regulation from councils a number of years ago and has worked to improve that system and build capacity in local government such that we have confidence that they can take it back and manage those issues. There are a number of sites we continue to regulate that are problematic, but generally speaking, councils are now responsible for those as well. So that program helps us to have confidence that even the lower risk sites that are in the hands of local government are managed well to minimise risks to public health and the environment. So I wanted now to speak a little more about some of the more significant issues that we've seen with land contamination in the Hunter region over the last few years. And one of the most high profile ones that we've dealt with is PFAS contamination at Williamtown, at the RAF base there, and off into the community. So PFAS is an acronym referring to per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And they're man-made substances that really came into the fore in the last 50 years or so, and are used in a range of products because of some of the great properties that they have. They don't easily break down, and they're heat resistant, so they're particularly useful in things like firefighting foams. They've also traditionally been in things like Teflon cookware, Scotchgard, Gore-Tex, and a whole range of other products. And some of the things that make them great for those domestic, commercial, industrial uses are also the things that make them most challenging as a pollutant in the environment. And to some degree, the scientific data is still limited in terms of the risks that PFAS poses, but there is certainly some scientific literature and studies that suggest hazards to the environment and human health. And we take a precautionary approach so that we look to minimise exposure and manage risk despite some of that scientific uncertainty. So PFAS can bioaccumulate in the environment, both in humans and animals. It has been found in things like Arctic foxes and polar bears, even though those species are generally far removed from industrial sources and the like. And often with contaminated sites, with something like a service station, we might see contamination extend tens or perhaps hundreds of metres from the source of contamination. But with something like PFAS, that's very stable, doesn't break down easily and bioaccumulates, we can see it in the environment for kilometres from a source site. And certainly appearing not only in soils and water, but also in biota. So as a result of all of that, we're engaged in a PFAS investigation program across New South Wales. We're dealing with about 49 high priority investigations that relate to some key sites, including in the Hunter, the RAF base at Williamtown, mines rescue stations at both Argenton and Singleton, and use at power stations, and also within Lake Macquarie itself from a range of potential sources. And that's just a snapshot of some of the sites. We're in fact been through an assessment process of over 900 sites across New South Wales to assess the risks that are posed. One of the reasons that RAF bases and Williamtown in particular are problematic for this issue is that firefighting foam was a key use for PFAS chemicals, and airports use a lot of firefighting foam essentially to manage the risk of aircraft fires. And it would seem that defence sites were particularly efficient and effective at doing training with the use of foam on a regular basis and used lots of it on those sites. And that's one of the reasons that we see it as an issue at Williamtown. One of the concerns about this site, and often with contamination, is community outrage around when they're informed about issues and when both polluters and regulators inform the community. And certainly that's been an issue of some concern with the Williamtown site. So Defence first advised the EPA that they were undertaking some investigations at Williamtown back in 2012. and started to do some assessments through 2013 to 2015. And it was only really in 2015 as we received reports from Defence that suggested pathways for human health exposure that we went about alerting the community in September of 2015. And as I say, a lot of concern raised by the community at that point around having not been told by both Defence and by state agencies about that issue. That issue's continued to bubble along. In 2016, a human health risk assessment was conducted by Defence and reviewed by the New South Wales expert panel, and a revised health risk assessment came out in 2017 with a final in December 2017. One of the key things then that the New South Wales government did was implement tailored advice to the community to manage their risk to these pollutants. And establish some management areas out there. One of the reasons for that is that because PFAS spreads so far and wide into the environment, while there is a desire to get Defence engaged in remediation activities on site and to stop the flow of further pollutants into the environment, it's a really difficult chemical to effectively remediate. And given it is spread so far in this case, essentially it's about seeing it attenuate over realistically decades, and therefore looking at minimising community exposure. One of the reasons that the Williamtown site is almost, I guess, a perfect storm for this contaminant is not only was there large-scale use of the chemical for many years on site, but the local topography and environment essentially allows that to spread very well. So you can see on that slide, you've got the raft base in the middle, and on the left-hand side, Fullerton Cove, part of the Hunter Estuary, and some of the waterways from the base flow to Fullerton Cove and the Hunter Estuary. But some of the drains to the right of the slide, in fact, flow through Moore's Drain, Tilligary Creek, into Port Stephens around Military Passage. You also have in this area significant use of bore water, including before this issue arose, some people in the community using bore water for drinking water, and lots of domestic and even some commercial agricultural activities as well. So people using not only groundwater for drinking, but for watering fruit and vegetables, people with chickens, eggs, and those sorts of things. So a contaminant in high usage, spread effectively through the environment, and then a very clear exposure pathway potential for people in the community. So essentially what our strategy has been here is to both work with Defence to minimise the flow of the material off-site and work on remediation, but also to put in place precautionary measures to minimise that exposure. So that's been encouraging people, for example, in the primary management zone, the most heavily contaminated area close to the base, to not use groundwater, bore water and surface water for any purpose. And some of the levels of contaminants in that area are sufficiently high that even using that water for purposes like washing the car or washing the dog could involve sufficient incidental ingestion to be of concern. And also advice not to consume home slaughtered meat, poultry, eggs, milk, fruit and vegetables. Of course, town water is safe to drink, and in fact, one of the strategies for government has been to install reticulated water supply to additional areas around Williamtown to ensure that the community have got safe access to water. We then have a secondary zone, and essentially you can see here the shades of blue moving out from the base. In the secondary and broader management zones, advice again not to use groundwater, bore water or surface water for drinking or cooking. Less concern about using it incidentally because the concentrations are low, and also restrictions on use of homegrown produce. So essentially the three zones reflect different levels of the contaminant in the environment. And for the broader management zone, You might note on the map there that it shows some square boundaries. Obviously, contaminants don't move in the environment along straight lines, but what we've essentially done is where we believe that, particularly during flood times, that following contours, water could inundate those properties. We've included those entire lots in the area so that we can ensure that essentially we've got a worst case scenario mapped out, and we can ensure that anyone potentially affected has precautions in place to minimise their exposure. This site essentially was the first PFAS site in New South Wales that we dealt with, and has very much informed that broader program that I indicated with those 900 or so sites now assessed, and has led also to significant work by Defence at numerous bases, both in New South Wales and around the country. And I think both the New South Wales Government and Defence have learnt a significant amount about the best ways to engage with communities around these sorts of contamination issues from this site. One of those is very clearly about informing the community as early as possible when you know about risks, and making sure that we're managing those. There's a lot of community impact still in this area, because we've seen depressed property prices and people who feel somewhat trapped on their properties and essentially unable to use the properties as they had intended, particularly those in that most affected zone near the base. So yeah, there's some of the key challenges that we've faced there, and as I say, some key learnings from that as well. I guess PFAS is more of an emerging chemical, something that we've only been dealing with in terms of concern about it, only in use for probably the last 50 or so years, but of concern for the last decade or so. Lead contamination in Lake Macquarie is, I guess, a little different, because we've both known about the hazards of lead for a longer period of time, but also the Pasminco smelter at Bullaroo was also in operation for much longer, in fact, from the late 1800s. So, as you can see here, the Pasminco Cockle Creek smelter operated just at Bullaroo, north of the lake, and produced a number of chemicals: zinc, lead, copper sulfate, cadmium, sulfuric acid, and selenium. Operated for around 100 years, slightly more. I think it was there in the very late 1800s, and had some significant environmental impacts while it was operating, and has certainly left a significant legacy in the local community as well. I should say too, I mean, one of the challenges we dealt with on the Williamtown site was the fact that the New South Wales State Government can't regulate the activities of the Commonwealth. So we had some challenges there with respect to dealing with them and essentially requiring their cooperation to get outcomes. In the case of Lake Macquarie, in fact, we end up with a company that ends up going into liquidation. And so a challenge of ensuring that that polluter continues to pay for the pollution that they've caused over a significant period of time. This slide here shows that one of the significant sources of contamination in the North Lake Macquarie area was in fact air emissions. I guess often with contamination we're dealing with leaks and spills of liquids to soil and other contaminants to soil. In this case, air emissions were a significant source of that contamination. The graph on the left is showing lead emissions and showing them decreasing from 1985 on the left through to 99 on the right. The significant thing there is that the unit of measure is in tonnes. So what that's showing is that back in 1985, the smelter was emitting 90 tonnes per annum of lead, and that's just, I've been using this slide for some time, but it it still blows me away just the significant amount of material that was being put into the environment back then. You're seeing lead in air concentrations on the right, and again, improvements initially as stricter emission standards were imposed by the EPA and its predecessors in the 80s and 90s, and then even further once the plant closed. One of the positives from that was that we did see significant improvements in blood lead levels once the smelter closed, because those airborne contaminants were in fact a significant vector for that contamination into people, more so just breathing in the contamination, more so than exposure to lead in soil and the like, but an ongoing risk nonetheless. Essentially, concern was raised, particularly into the 90s, around contamination around the plant, and work was done to identify areas that were subject to contamination. Essentially, a grid was developed around the site that extended across Uluru and Argenton, to some degree down to Spears Point and up to Moneybung Hill, and that's largely driven by where the wind blew emissions from the stack. One of the complicating factors for this site, though, was that essentially we weren't just dealing with airborne contamination or deposition from airborne contamination onto properties, but the site produced significant quantities of slag, which is a byproduct of the smelting process. And for many years, that slag was seen as safe. The heavy metals were considered to be bound up in a glassy matrix. And it's great stuff for filling in hills and hollows in sporting fields, backyards, and was used for landscaping, filling around the lake foreshore, and a whole range of uses, and essentially was given away for free from the smelter. So not only did you have properties that had levels of contamination arising from the smelter itself, but people had willingly taken it and essentially polluted their own properties by applying that material. And it was harder to know where that material was. Of course, the use of that material extends beyond the areas affected by airborne contamination. You can see in the slide there large piles of the slag on site, but also down below some evidence of where slag's previously been used in a foreshore park around the lake. I think that's at Marmong Point. And following some heavy storms and some erosion, essentially that slag material is exposed on the surface. And there's some of the legacy issues that we're facing with this type of material. So essentially, as the smelter was heading towards closure, Pasminco was required to prepare a lead abatement strategy, and that was about looking to minimise exposure to contamination in surface soils. And that continued through the process where the smelter was decommissioned. One of the challenges, though, was that while almost 2,000 properties were eligible to participate in the program, around 750 didn't participate, and there are a range of reasons for that, but essentially Pasminco was requiring people to sign away any future liability with respect to contamination and the smelter, and a lot were unwilling to do that. And you can see in the graph there that some of the levels of contamination were quite significantly above guidelines. The screening criteria for lead is 300 parts per million, and essentially you've got about 80% of the properties there are above that level. So there was significant concern arose in the community around 2014 about whether the lead abatement strategy had achieved its objectives. There was some work done by Macquarie University, Professor Mark Taylor and a number of his postgrad students looking at measuring lead levels that remained in surface soils in the Uluru area. And there were significant levels recorded. That resulted in a campaign run by the Newcastle Herald called Toxic Truth. They ran over 100 articles related to this issue, and in fact, it then morphed into dealing with issues broader, such as Williamtown. And in response to that, the EPA established a lead expert working group consisting of representatives from the EPA, Health, Council, and academics, as well as a site auditor involved in the smelter site itself. We also established a community reference group with business and community representatives chaired by Greg Piper, the local member, and the two groups worked hand in hand to identify ways to improve the issue. And in 2016, the group published 13 findings and 22 recommendations, which I'm pleased to say were unanimously adopted and endorsed by government. Some of the key findings out of the expert working group process was, interestingly, that while lead levels remained high in soil in many properties, blood lead levels, particularly in children, remained quite low. Working with New South Wales Health, we undertook blood lead testing of around 75 children and a number of pregnant women who resided in the area. And essentially none of those people tested had blood lead levels above the screening criteria. And that demonstrates the capacity essentially for us to live with some of these legacy contaminants in the environment, so long as we've got appropriate measures in place to manage exposure. And so while that's pleasing, we felt that it was important that we make sure that there were ongoing measures to manage that risk and essentially continue to test where appropriate. We also identified some risks around groundwater, and in fact, we're just concluding now some work on testing groundwater to look at whether or not we're seeing leaching of materials from slag in particular into groundwater and having any impact on lake water quality. We also identified a concern particularly around development activity for residents in the area and the cost of carrying out development works. Essentially, because the smelter had closed and gone into liquidation, we couldn't hold the polluter to account as readily as we would normally. And so to some degree, the cost of remediating sites when development occurred fell to the landowner. And that could involve significant extra burden on residents to undertake assessments, do remediation, and particularly the cost of removal of contaminated soil to an appropriate facility was significant. So some of the key outcomes from that process, essentially we now have officers in the EPA dedicated to managing the recommendations from this work and lead contamination more broadly. We deal with significant issues around Lake Macquarie, but also areas like Broken Hill and some of the urban areas of Sydney as well. We established a 4-year $800,000 grant to council, and that was to help them build further education materials for residents, do some research, and essentially a small grant program to support further assessment remediation by residents. I mentioned the blood lead sampling for children and pregnant women, a study on marine bioaccumulation of lead in Lake Macquarie, which has dovetailed with some broader work on assessing essentially contaminants in biota in the lake, including PFAS. Looking at leachability of slag, we established a simpler process for disposing of lead at the Summerhill waste facility at Wallsend. And we reviewed whether or not the lead contamination grid was still an appropriate mechanism to guide decisions about contamination in this area. We've also established a lead strategy group, which pulls together agencies like Health, EPA and Safe Work to make sure we've got a formed up position from government on dealing with lead contamination, not only around significant industrial sites like Lake Macquarie and Broken Hill, but also across the community more broadly, including where people are renovating properties with lead paint and also where people live close to areas affected by leaded petrol particularly in Sydney. So there's some of the key challenges around some of the legacy issues faced from a single smelter. To move to another activity that fortunately we don't see much of these days, and that's Gasworks. And there were a number of Gasworks sites, both around the Hunter and the state more broadly, essentially gas produced from coal rather than natural gas, and used to power things like lighting back in the early 1900s, but a process that was quite dirty and produced significant contamination, things like tars, and requires significant remediation to manage risk. Waratah Gasworks is an unusual one in that it's only in the last couple of years that this site came to the notice of both council and the EPA. So the Gasworks operated around 100 years ago, and in fact closed in the 1920s, and was subsequently sold and developed for residential land. It was only back in 2017 that we received an inquiry from a resident who'd come across some old maps that depicted a gasworks on the site and inquired about it. And interestingly, neither the EPA or the local council at that stage had knowledge of the site. Newcastle City Council then undertook some preliminary investigations and established that yes, the site had been used for that purpose, and in fact there were now 20 residential properties within the footprint of that gasworks site. There's essentially, you'll see there a purple and a blue area within the yellow triangle. This is Waratah, right near Waratah Village, and there's sort of two levels of contamination there, a more serious level of contamination and a lower risk one. Some of these properties, in fact, have some of the old infrastructure buried on their properties, and there'll be some varying challenges in terms of remediation of some of those sites. We issued a draft declaration in relation to this site back in 2019, and we're continuing to work to get this one resolved, and keeping residents informed, working with council, and also Property New South Wales and Gemina. Gemina is the essentially inheritor of the former Gasworks company, which was initially, in fact, operated by a predecessor of Newcastle Council, but was bought by the predecessor of Gemina and AGL many years ago. That's posed some challenges for us in identifying the polluter and the person most appropriate to carry out the works on the site. And we're currently investigating some options around the best way to fund remediation on that site before proceeding with some further work. Not too far away in Hamilton North, essentially the Waratah Gasworks was replaced by a much bigger gasworks operated by AGL that was in the Hamilton North area, and that site has been the subject of declarations by the EPA. There's a management order in force under the Contaminated Land Management Act that relates to this site. And Gemina have recently completed remediation on this site in accordance with the order. And also we've had completion of a site audit by an EPA accredited consultant site auditor that's confirmed that those works have been appropriate. One of the challenges here is preventing contamination in terms of surface access, but also contamination flowing to the Styx Creek, which flows adjacent to the site. And so some of the work that's been done includes essentially a barrier wall to stop that contamination flowing off site, and also a cap across the site that reduces further infiltration of rainwater, surface water into groundwater, and also provides a barrier to prevent access to contaminated material. That site will need ongoing monitoring and maintenance to manage risk, and that's done through our ongoing regulatory arrangements with the site. it's made that site suitable for ongoing industrial commercial activities. It's certainly not a site that you would see for residential use into the future, but it has been a case where both the contaminated land management process through the EPA and the planning process have worked hand in hand to deliver an outcome so that that site can now be put to a much better use. It was vacant for a long period of time. One of the other things that you might note from this site is the Hamilton North area. Essentially, you've got residential land in quite close proximity to that site, but also to essentially the Hamilton North suburb is surrounded by industrial activities. You've got the Gilligan site to the west, and a number of sites like the former Electric Lamp Works and the Black & Decker site to the north. So while we traditionally take a site-by-site contaminated land investigation approach, we've taken a different approach with Hamilton and gone through and engaged with the local community, done water use surveys and undertaken sampling of groundwater bores where available, so that we can essentially say, look, regardless of where it might have come from, we want to understand what contaminants might be in play in your area and make sure that we've got appropriate steps in place to minimise your exposure. I also forgot to mention there's another PFAS site from a former chrome plating facility just to the northwest there. So some challenges there that we've worked through well. The community is now well aware of those risks. We've got tailored precautionary advice to make sure that they're managing the risks that might come from use of groundwater, for example, or consumption of fruit and vegetables that might be watered with groundwater. And that helps us to make sure that they're safe. While we work with landowners and polluters to remediate sites and minimise those risks. So really that's what I wanted to cover in terms of the process and some of the key challenges we've faced in recent times, and really just wanted to provide the opportunity now for any comments or questions that you might have.
Thanks, Adam. That was very interesting hearing all about the remediation that's happening all around the Hunters and things I didn't know about Waratah, and I know about the Hamilton North area. That's near where I live, so that's of great interest to me too. Now, have we got any questions? I haven't got any questions. Someone asked if this is being recorded. It is being recorded, and we hope to make it available later on for people to watch. But we're hoping that people might have some comments or some questions they want to ask Adam while he's online. So if you've got a question, we've got one coming up. So Kirsty Greenfield has asked, will the results of the study into leaching of lead from black slag into groundwater be publicly available?
Yes, it will. We'll make that available on the EPA website in due course. And we also work closely with Lake Macquarie Council with respect to this, and we'll engage with them further on it as well.
Thanks, Adam. Got any other questions that people want to ask? You can raise your hand if you like, and I'll make it so you can actually talk. I can work it out. It's very quiet. We've had over 40 people online today, and they've all stayed, so it must have been a very interesting presentation with everyone. So there we go. So Balaji says he's a researcher at the university, and he thanks you for a great presentation. He's working on waste material utilisation. What are the avenues of collaborative work between the uni and the EPA?
Look, certainly our waste framework involves using opportunities for resource recovery innovation where we can. Often the process involves essentially classifying most things as waste and then providing exemptions for the use of those materials where we can. We've got a team based in Sydney who focus on that work, and I'd certainly be happy to put Balaji in touch with those officers involved in resource recovery so that we can work together.
Maybe if we can Balaji, if you can get in contact with us through our website or Facebook, you can send us a message and we'll get in contact with Adam. Balaji says, thank you, that would be great. Any other questions? Oh, here we go. Shafan, do you want to read out the next one?
Yes, Fiona. So Ian asks, who is the current regional technical support person to the Hunter Council?
A great question, Ian. And I unfortunately haven't got that information in front of me. It's someone we've got embedded in the Hunter JO, but happy to get that information to you after the session.
And there was one more question by Chris, who asks, what is happening with the TruGain site at Rutherford in regard to remediation from PFAS and other chemicals?
Yeah, good question. The TruGain site at Rutherford is a challenging one. So, and you might see a theme here that one of the challenges emerges when we're dealing with absent polluters or owners, and that makes holding the polluter to account more challenging. So TruGain is a former waste oil refinery in the Rutherford industrial estate, and essentially the company went into liquidation a number of years ago, leaving significant quantities of waste oil, much of which was contaminated with PFAS on site, some in tanks, some in bunds, some no doubt contaminating soil and groundwater under the site. Essentially, the EPA has a number of orders in force against the owner and is seeking to hold the owner to account. We've actually had a number of matters in court earlier this year and further matters under consideration. We've actually taken the step of putting contractors onto the site ourselves to manage the risk of contamination leaving the site. So we've got pump out occurring on a regular basis, particularly after heavy rain, to ensure that we don't see overflow of PFAS or other contaminants into the local waterways. And essentially we're out to tender at the moment for a long-term solution that would see essentially material removed from the site and made safe to prevent ongoing risks.
And it seems like we have one more question by Rick in the chat. He was asking, is there a public register of contaminated sites?
Yes, there's a register on the EPA website, so epa.nsw.gov.au, with respect to the sites that we regulate. And with those regulated by councils, you can approach your local council for information about those, particularly through the 10.7 certificate process.
We've got one more that's just come through from Scott Carroll. He's asked, are there any opportunities to present to the EPA regarding research and technology that might help achieve a better outcome or provide food for thought with regards to some of the more difficult problems you have encountered on some of these sites? Is there any scope to look at a few of these sites and combine a scope to drive economy of scale for some of the technologies that could solve similar problems on a number of different sites simultaneously? Or will it only be a single site at a time due to different polluters, landowners, etc.?
Look, that's a great question, and I think we encourage innovation and further research where we can. One of the challenges, I guess, is that often we're not the ones doing the remediation. We're requiring that remediation take effect, but it's a matter of talking to site owners and their consultants to determine what the most appropriate technologies to use might be. Certainly, though, I think we're happy to liaise and partner with researchers in this space. We've certainly worked with others in the past. I know, for example, one of the more innovative ones for PFAS at Williamtown has been looking at whether cannabis crops can take PFAS out of the soil and remove it. So yeah, there's a whole range of options out there. As I say, then once you get a trial of a technology like that, it's really up to polluters and their consultants to determine whether they want to employ that and engage with researchers on it.
There's a question by Rick. He was saying, can contaminated sites be used without remediation? How do the risks carry forward?
I guess that depends to a large extent on the nature of the contamination. And I showed earlier how we deal with the more acute issues where there's immediate contamination issues that need to be addressed. I guess one of the reasons that much of the remainder of contamination is left to the planning process is that we're satisfied that those risks don't need to be addressed immediately. If you've got a site that's carrying out an industrial use and might have caused some contamination, but it's continuing to be used for that industrial purpose, it's likely to be that the risks for human health exposure in the environment may be more readily contained while that activity continues. But certainly if you're going to move to a more sensitive land use that might involve greater interaction between humans and say soil and groundwater or dust off a site, then that's when it might be appropriate to intervene. But it's very much a case of looking at what the contaminants are, what the potential pathways are for contamination of humans in the environment, and whether or not that requires urgent intervention.
Excellent. Well, I think we've answered everybody's questions, and there's been lots of people saying thanks for the great presentation, Adam, and Ian Gregson said that he likes the idea of the fire-resistant cannabis. So yeah, I think we've addressed everybody's thing, but if you've got more questions, I'm sure that you'd be able to contact Adam at the EPA. But thank you very much, Adam, for your presentation. We really appreciate the time and the effort you've gone into doing such a great presentation for us. And we hope that this will be available soon so people can share it with others if they missed out today.
My pleasure, Fiona. Thank you.
So thanks again to Adam, and we look forward to seeing everybody around again with us soon at our next seminar. It was going to be a webinar seminar hybrid. So our next one is going to be on Threatened Species Day, which is 12th of May. And we're lucky enough to be able to have Dr. Kira Milam, who's the Global Director of Strategic Partnerships for the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, the Species Survival Commission. So Kira is from Newcastle originally, and she studied her doctorate and her undergrads here in Newcastle. And she's been working for the IUCN over in Bath and more recently in the USA, and is currently in quarantine and looking forward to getting out and meeting us in person, because she really hasn't seen many people in the last few months, almost a year probably. So Kira is a science communicator focusing on species conservation through collaborative partnerships. Kira works to connect 9,000 scientists from 163 countries with organisations, governments, donors and practitioners to collectively ensure species survival. Kira is galvanising a global community of zoos and other conservation partners under an ambitious decade-long strategy to support governments in reversing trends in species loss. She helped orchestrate an unprecedented partnership to save the Sumatran rhino by uniting partners like World Wildlife Fund and National Geographic Society with the IUCN and the Indonesian government under a common strategy. She's lived in 3 continents and worked in 29 countries over the past 5 years, and she sits on the Council of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums. She was recently awarded the International Leadership Award from the University of Newcastle for her work, which is an amazing achievement. You can read more about Kira on the Alumni of Newcastle University website if you want to know more about her. And she will be joined by some researchers from the University of Newcastle who are working on conservation of the threatened green gong bell frogs. So it'll be great to have both presentations at our next seminar, which is going to be in person at New Space on the 12th of May, or also available online. Our link will be available soon, so you can watch it or get involved and share it with your friends and register for the event. You might want a presentation in March was from Dr. Dragomir Garbov, and he presented on Secrets of the Black Seas. And that was a fantastic presentation. If you haven't seen it, please check it out. He had some really interesting things to say about the work that he was doing in the Black Sea. If you're interested in getting involved in the HEI committee or have suggestions for events, please contact us via the Facebook page or through our website, or just sign up for the newsletter. Reminder that annual memberships are now due, and for more information you can find out on our website. And I'm pleased to announce that we have opened up applications for a student internship opportunity. So you would have heard Shafan speaking earlier. He's one of our interns, and we're opening up for a new intern take as of now, and it's open until the 16th of May. And you can see the information that's on our website currently on the screen. So we're looking for expressions of interest from student interns as a volunteer position with HEI committee. You're expected to attend monthly meetings and assist in organising events and social media, events like today. And this will be a time commitment of not more than an hour a week over a 6 to 9 month period. So Shafan has been helping me in the background today, and he's been instrumental in working with the committee to help develop our procedures, website and social media presence. So if you know someone who might be interested, please let them know, and all they have to do is put an application through our Facebook page. The information's there. Thanks again to Adam for his presentation, and to our web hosts from the University of Newcastle. I really appreciate the help from Troy, Gaston in the background, and from Ryan Jeffries, and of course from Shafana intern. Thank you for joining us.